join me in welcoming our guest speaker today, Greg Lukianoff.
Hey, everybody. I had been working on a talk to try to match the moment and the gravity of what happened here for the last several weeks as I travel all over the country. And then I realized that that was not possible. Something historical happened here in the worst possible meaning of that word. And all I can really do is, grieve with you to some degree and try to explain why I think what happened was so important. And in order to talk about that, I should tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a first-generation American. My dad is Russian by way of Yugoslavia. My mother is British by way of Ireland. By way of Ireland. And I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of other first-generation immigrant kids. Some from Vietnam, some from South America, some from... a lot of us were either, our families were escaping totalitarianism or authoritarianism. And we all had very different ideas, and our parents in particular had very different ideas about what you shouldn't be allowed to say. But we all knew that there was something very special about America. And my biggest fear is that we are becoming just like everybody else. Because it's frustrating sometimes for first-generation Americans, because sometimes we get talked down to a little bit by real Americans. Essentially that we don't really understand this country. And I say, no. If you're from here, you don't see it with our eyes. You don't see it as a place that we came to step outside of history. What do I mean stepping outside of history? History is a story of powerful people using every lever at their disposal to deal with their enemies and accumulate the most power they can for themselves. History is a story of being afraid to say what you really think because someone might kill you for it. We escaped that, and that wasn't something we had to worry about here. And as I kind of moved up through fancier schools and all this kind of stuff, got to meet more wealthier people, the more I realized the specialness of our system here was taken for granted. And I fear when you lose the recognition that something's special about you, it ceases to exist. It's kind of like, that cool, amazing kid you all knew in grade school who suddenly becomes incredibly lame because he's trying to be like everybody else. And you just want them to remember what made them so special. They usually find it again at some point in their lives, but it's always kind of heartbreaking to see it. Small L liberalism is special. It is the idea that actually human beings having more freedom and less control actually produces better results. It means people are happier, it means that they are more productive, it means that they're more prosperous, but it also means, most importantly, they are more themselves. That's not normal historically. It's wonderful, and it's something to celebrate. But I'm not willing to accept America becoming like everybody else. On our 250th anniversary, I want us to recognize that there was something special. And by the way, I watched this get sneered at as the idea of sort of American exceptionalism. But just as a historical fact, America is historically weird. It is a place that, when you look at its history, it sounds like a tall tale. That if you told people about this place where, you'd have a neighborhood with people literally from all over the world just kind of hanging out and playing soccer together, because my dad would say something like this. He'd be like, "Oh, Americans, they think they're so, diverse and stuff, but there were dozens of different kinds of nationalities in Russia." And it's true. He's absolutely right. The diversity within the vast scheme of the Russian Empire is massive. But they were generally people who'd lived close to each other for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. There's something quite different about a place where people who lived in populations that grew up entirely with utterly different cultures, you know, hanging out watching Star Trek that weekend. It is special and it's worth fighting for. Now, I had a lot of disagreements with Charlie Kirk. He's a religious conservative, and I am a liberal-leaning atheist. But I realized that I didn't like his scholar watch list, for example, that Turning Point USA did. I have, however, defended Turning Point USA chapters all over the country because they have a right to exist on campus. But my disagreements with him just seem so tiny now. They seem so irrelevant. They seem barely worth mentioning, other than to make the point that, you know, like that I had to make the point that essentially I wanted to reevaluate, you know, him after he was murdered here. And I watched a lot of the videos of him engaging with students. And I have to say, I was impressed. I would not have had the patience for that. I wouldn't have shown the kind of poise he did sometimes. I watched this argument that he had with a student who was really mad at him for saying that the founders didn't like the word democracy. And it's like, okay, I'm a constitutional lawyer. The founders did not like the word democracy. They really didn't, because they associate it with mob rule, and they associate it with the will of the majority. That's a really important point. That's why they insisted we were a representative republic, where the will of the majority doesn't mean that I have to go to jail. We have rights that are very difficult to take away. And no matter like how many times he explained, and he's factually right, the student just insisted that he was saying something insulting to him. So here's the thing, though, is that violence always backfires. You shouldn't be violent because you shouldn't be violent. But it also tends to backfire. It results in something, it has a funny name. It's called the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is when Barbra Streisand, when she tried to make sure that nobody could see a picture of her new mansion, she sued a reporter or a newspaper for putting this picture up. And of course, at that point, there'd been like 4 views of her new mansion. As soon as she did that, tens of thousands of people became interested in Barbra Streisand's mansion. Censorship tends to backfire. So people who thought they could sort of silence ideas they didn't like from Charlie Kirk by murdering him, they amplified them forever. Now, I'm going to admit something. That might kind of surprise you a little bit because, you know, you live here. But when I was asked to do this, I was a little scared. And my family was a little scared. They didn't particularly want me to come here. I mean, obviously I wasn't overwhelmingly scared because I'm here. But part of me is torn that that's not right. I shouldn't be scared to speak on a campus, ever. And then I thought, well, but of course Charlie Kirk's murder changed that. But then I remembered, that's not even the only one that's happened. Salman Rushdie, someone tried to kill him on a college campus just a few years ago. An assailant came at him with a knife for blasphemy. And he really, if medical technology wasn't as advanced as it was, he definitely would have died. And then I think about my friends, people I love. You know, like, do they have to worry for their lives now? I think about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and then I remember that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a friend, a dear person, who is a secularist who opposes radical religion, but particularly opposes the religion she grew up with, Islam. She has to travel with security everywhere. Her life is always in danger. And she's a very sweet, thoughtful person. I think about my friend David French, who's a conservative, who really has angered the right, and he's constantly getting death threats. I do think his life is in danger. I think about my friend Barry Weiss, who is hated by people on the left to a degree that boggles my mind, possibly one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my life. She is often afraid for her life. My friend Sarah Hyder, who is someone who is an ex-Muslim, is scared. And then I think about everybody that I know who's gender critical, who thinks that actually the gender ideology that has hit campus is crazy or way too intense. Are they all in danger? And that's the thing, is that as much revulsion as I have to it, this is welcome back to history. This is us being just like everyone else. And I want us to be better than this. The First Amendment. Sometimes people say that the First Amendment, that the American Revolution was essentially a conservative revolution. It wasn't as radical as the French Revolution. Well, I actually think it's the other way around. The French Revolution was a conservative revolution. It was just like all the rest of history. Some basically religious figure who doesn't like to think of himself as religious says, I know the one true way. I, your philosopher king, will now actually radically transform our society in a way that will make us better, make us different kinds of human beings. Congratulations, welcome back to the 13th century or the 2nd century or the 8th century. The idea that basically the wise and smart can actually change us for our own good internally forever. Meanwhile, in the American Revolution, we took human nature very seriously. We took the limitations of what we can know, of what makes us wonderful and horrible, predictable and loving, all of these things. They took it very seriously. They studied it. And they came up with a system that has endured. And part of that, though, the idea that anyone would dare to call this in some way conservative, which they mean is an insult, when the rights that I defend, the First Amendment, tried to, in one single word, protect freedom of speech, freedom of association, assembly, freedom to petition the government, and decided in one religion clause, decided to both protect your right to practice whatever religion you choose to believe in and your right to be free from the government imposing faith on you. That is, if that is not radical, then nothing is radical. It's saying that we are going to stop battling over the things that had led to so much bloodshed over time. And going against it to decide we're not going to do that anymore is a massive step backwards. Now, another point about fear, and that's a big part of what I'm here to talk about today, fear and violence. I'm also scared for my staff in a different perspective. I'm scared for my organization, and that's because we're currently opposing the government a lot. Did I used to be scared when we took the government to court? No. And as an American, I should not have to be scared when I take the government to court. But we're currently battling an administration that seems to be willing to use, just like I said, is situation normal for history, situation normal for Putin or for Xi or for any of these other countries, that the government will use any lever of power at its disposal to go after its opponents. I've watched this at law firms, I've watched this for the media, and I've watched this in higher ed. And by the way, Trump has gone after every single law firm that opposed him on almost anything at this point, except so far one exception. He has not yet attacked fire. But am I worried that he will? Yeah, because we are in court with him right now in a case involving a pollster named Ann Selzer. Ann Selzer is a pollster. How many people here know who Ann Selzer is? Okay, she used to be considered the gold standard of polling. The techniques she used were actually really effective, say 20 years ago, when more people had landline phones. She did a poll that got a lot more coverage around the time of the election that said Harris was actually ahead in Iowa by 2 points. She was very wrong on this poll. And Trump won, by like 11 points or something like that. She explained how she got it wrong, why the methodology she was using was no longer very effective. She apologized for it, and she retired. All, I think, quite noble. But Trump sued her in Iowa under a consumer protection law that's basically supposed to protect you from ads that say, like take these pills and lose 40 pounds a day type things. And so it makes no sense whatsoever. But he's suing her, and I'm proud to say that among the very few institutions that have actually been willing to stand up to Trump, Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register are among them. But am I worried that being in court against Trump can come with ramifications? Yeah, you bet I am. And that's wrong. I'm even standing up for people who said after the murder of Charlie Kirk that he had it coming. I don't much care for these people, but so what? There's a great quote from a case called Barnett. Freedom to differ is not limited to that which does not matter much. That is a mere shadow of freedom. Freedom to differ only matters when it cuts to the existing order itself. So yeah, I believe that people who said flippant things after the death of Charlie Kirk have the right to do that. Not because I think that's commendable, but for one reason, it's valuable to know what people really think. It's always valuable to know what people really think. You are not safer for knowing less about what people really think. That's a fool's safety. And right now, we're dealing with 81 examples of people getting punished or being targeted for saying things about after the death of Charlie Kirk on campus. That's comparable to how many cases we had involving comments that were considered insensitive about race in 2020, which was one of the craziest years I'd ever seen. We're dealing with, so it is a crisis right now. Do I like the fact that the Trump administration is actually using the assassination here as an attempt to go against its enemies again? Yes, I do think it's outrageous. But at the same time, I will never shy, from defending even speech that I fundamentally disagree with. In fact, I kind of think it's cheating as a First Amendment lawyer to defend speech you like. It's too easy. That's what everybody does. It only really matters if you defend speech that curls your own toes. So, and I guess my final theme before I get to questions, and I love questions, is. Oh, actually, no, I wanted to make one more point on speech versus violence. After Charlie Kirk was killed, I wrote an article for my friend, Barry Weiss, who I mentioned already, in the Free Press. And I talked about this rhetorical escalation I've seen on campus, that essentially offensive speech can be violence. I have fought against this as long as it's been around. And by the way, earlier on in my career, everyone knew that this was rhetoric. This was something that basically, to make yourself feel superior to the people who defend freedom of speech, you say, well, your words are violence. As students, for example, shouted at Ann Coulter, a conservative comedian, essentially, who came to Cornell, who spoke at Cornell. They shouted her down. They prevented the event from going on. They said your words are violence. There are a lot of thinkers who actually make this argument that words are either akin to or very similar to violence. And I think what we saw here should refute that forever, and that people who make that argument should feel ashamed of themselves. And I have it for two different reasons. One is actually philosophical, that essentially free speech is the best cure for violence ever invented. The idea that we were in history and then the printing press came, and then almost as soon as it existed, there were people like John Lilburn, John Milton, who came out and said, maybe this is our way out. Maybe this is our chance to actually fight things out, not with bullets and not with bayonets, but with words. Free speech is one of the greatest tools for peace ever invented. It is like a peace treaty with ourselves. And we abandon it at our peril. And if we abandon it for something as foolish as wanting a rhetorical advantage over other people, that's madness. And then, of course, this bothers me at a visceral level. When I was 14, one of my friends, this was mid-March, it was weirdly hot. I was in high school. I was walking to through the parking lot after school, caught up in my own head. And I saw him kind of woozy and sort of stumbling, kind of like this sort of thing. And there was kind of a half circle around him, and I didn't really understand what was going on. And as I got closer, I realized his face was all red. And then as I got a little closer still, I realized his shirt was open and his chest was all red. And then I realized it was all coming out of a spot just about here. He'd been stabbed in the chest. He wasn't the good guy in this fight. He'd actually been bullying someone, and they stabbed him. And as I turned around to run to get help, I was sure my friend was dead. He managed to survive, somewhat longer. And that's what I think of when people say words are violence. I think anybody who saw what happened that day here knows how insulting it is, and the compliment people are paying themselves when they say words are violence. That I'm brave, I have survived words. That's kidding yourself. When you've actually seen deadly violence, you'll never take that for granted again, or at least I hope we won't, although I'm afraid very many people are taking it for granted right now. So all I can really ask is that people be brave. Curiosity and braveness, a sort of humble braveness, is the only cure for the situation we're currently in. Say what you really think. Be willing to listen and try to figure out where people are coming from. Don't ever pretend that words can be the same thing as violence. But try to learn a little bit more about how different our experiment has been. Try to appreciate it a little bit more, because we will appreciate it badly when it's gone, or if it should go. But I'll be the last to stop fighting for it. And hopefully you will be too. Freedom of speech, our constitutional order, they are special things. And the people who are saying that I'm going to be tough, I'm going to actually use the levers of government, the levers of power, that is about as boring as history has ever been. And institutions that actually believe that their dogmas are basically truth that all of you people must accept are also historically boring. They're about as predictable as anything else in history. The ability to actually recognize that you are simply a citizen in a democratic society filled with fears and biases, that you don't understand the world all by yourself, and you cannot. To actually look beyond ourselves, to take seriously the possibility we might be wrong, listen, and not only to defend our own opinion, but to defend the opinion that we hate. That's what makes us special. I hope that what happened here could be part of that wake-up call. I hope that what happened here could be part of that moment when we turn around and say no. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but I hope you'll join us and FIRE in the fight to keep these special protections, the eternally radical idea of free speech, free. Thank you.